Hi, I'm Dan Kazakoff. In the Faculty of Management at University of Lethbridge. I'm the Assistant Dean of what we call our educational or experiential education programs. And as part of that is case competitions. And so I obviously would like to thank you for participating in our Cor Van Raay agribusiness competition. I think you're going to have a wonderful time. And what I'm going to try and do to you is try to give you at least some insight as maybe how you can handle a case. There really isn't any one way in which to do case analysis. Over the years I've coached many teams and been a judge in many competitions, and you see a wide variety of techniques, but there is some fundamental things that you should think about. So for those of you who've already done a lot of cases, this might just be a review, might give you maybe some insights. For those of you who haven't done many cases, then hopefully this will provide a foundation so when you're in the competition for the part dealing with the case, you'll feel a little bit confident. At least you might have a process that you can handle that. Before I begin, though, to talk about cases, I just wanted to say a big thank you. As students, obviously, you're extremely busy, and I think you're going to have a wonderful time, but it says a lot that you'd represent your universities and colleges here in the competition and take a lot of time out of a busy life that you have to take advantage of this experience. You're going to have a lot of fun, and I hope, again, when you look back and reflect back on your experience, that you'll find that it was valuable, not only in the experience itself, but maybe later on in terms of maybe transferring some skills to you there. So in terms of then beginning with case analysis, I'd like to start off maybe just even talking to you about why we actually use cases in business and management schools and a lot of other disciplines as well. There is actually a rationale for that. So, you have been given the slides as well as some electronic handouts that I'll refer to as part of the workshop, so you can follow along. I would recommend as well, if you haven't yet printed off the electronic handouts, it'd probably be wise maybe to pause and print those out, because I think they'll be valuable if you have them right by your hand, or at least having access to them on your computer. So the case method provides the opportunity to move from more of a narrow, specialized view that emphasizes functional techniques to more broader, less precise analysis of the overall organization. And what this tries to get at is that when you take most classes, and you're given various assignments or exercises, they have a tendency, again, to be very functionally oriented. So if you're in a marketing class or an accounting class or an HR class, the exercises that you do have a tendency to be very much just in that discipline. What most cases do is provide kind of a more broader strategic type of situation where you're trying to not only bring a functional perspective, but you're trying to integrate knowledge across different functions and, more importantly, tied into an overall strategy of an organization. And I think you'll find that with the case that you'll be given for the competition is that it's not just solely, just one way in which to kind of solve it through a functional perspective. And it's the reason why we do that as well is that you never want to bias case in terms of an edge for someone who might just be, let's say, an accounting wizard or a marketing wizard. The idea behind a good case is that it integrates knowledge and gets people to think more strategically. There is a caveat, is that there are certain competitions where they are very much functional. So you do have specific, let's say, a tax competition or a specific maybe labor relations type of competition or a specific marketing competition. And those ones are trying to really test you on those functional bases or a narrow type of area of specialization, whereas again in more broader competitions like this one, it's more kind of strategic, and that's what you'll find here. And again, cases present actual business situations that enable you to examine both successful and unsuccessful organizations. So what we find is that cases generally are a written document about something that has occurred either in the recent past or maybe even going back a little ways. And it's kind of describing a situation that an organization or an individual in an organization is dealing with. And then what happens is that you, as students reading the case, are trying to immerse yourself in that situation and then kind of giving recommendations as to what you would do or would have done had that situation been there. And just because it's historical, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because an organization actually did do something to solve that issue, that that's what they should have done. And maybe your insights would have been more valuable to the organization had they actually done that. So again, the idea is you critically analyze the situation in which a manager has to make some type of long-term decision. And the approach really gives you a sense of what it's like to be in that situation. And that's the whole idea here. It's almost like a more immersive role-playing. So yeah, you're going to read your case. It's going to be about an organization or an individual dealing with a certain issue or issues. And the idea then is for you to be part of that and actually feel like, you know, you are right there and there in that organization trying to deal with that. And again, by systematically analyzing the situation, hopefully you'll be able to provide some insight as to what the organization should do. Why then do we do cases in terms of maybe learning objectives for students? So students benefit by understanding kind of the roles individuals play in the success of an organization. You get a chance to develop some good analytical skills, obviously, looking at, you know, the assessment of the firm and the capabilities. You know, you get to practice trying to identify key strategic issues when you're going to be a practicing professional. And some of you may already, you know, have had a lot of work experience. You know, that is a key type of competency that will differentiate you. So again, case competitions are a great opportunity in which to develop those skills. And then again, you really do get the sense of business judgment and hopefully, you know, an exposure to lots of different situations. It gives you a sense then that, you know, as a student, given these type of situations that you know, you've put yourself in, you'll develop kind of confidence in dealing with these situations. And so when you then actually graduate and are dealing with them in a real life situation, then obviously you'll be happy to, you know, deal with that because you'll be confident you've done these before. A few things, though, that are important is that knowing facts, theories, and concepts really gives you some type of like toolbox, right? So here it gives you a chance to take your knowledge that you've been getting from your courses and the experiences that you've had in the past and actually allow you now to take kind of a lot of that theory and put it into practice, right? So it gives you that kind of foundation and now you get a chance to practically apply it and use it. And, you know, it's one thing to have tools, but then it's obviously another thing to be able then to utilize them in the most efficient and effective manner possible. And that's what, you know, this case competition will do for you. Pointing out something that obviously is foundational, I think, to understanding kind of competitions and cases is that there really isn't one right answer to the case. As I mentioned previously, that just because a company did something in a historical manner in the past, given the scenario you've been given, that doesn't necessarily mean that they should have done that. There obviously are a lot of wrong ways in which to come up with answers to a situation, but there are a lot of ways. So what you have to develop as a team is your own type of processes and confidence in terms of, you know, delivering what you believe to be the solution to the situation in the case. So don't be scared that the judge, let's say, are looking only for one specific type of answer. They're not. It really comes down to more of the rationale and the analytical and systematic thinking that you get by going through the case to get at your answer. That's what really is a key here. So again, there isn't just one right answer. There are many right answers. And again, in the real world, people have to make decisions without really knowing if their decisions are right, because you don't know that until after the fact. And again, you know, you make their decision based on a lot of different things, right? And so, you know, oftentimes you also don't have every piece of information that you might like to have. And so you have to kind of make that decision and go on, right? I mean, a term that probably some of you have heard is satisficing, in the sense that in an ideal world, you could take all the time and money and resources to gather all the information that you want to make you feel more confident in your final decisions. But the world is constantly going on, right? It's constantly ongoing. And as a result of that, you can't just take forever to make decisions. Otherwise, that opportunity or that issue will take care of itself, probably in a negative way, before you have that opportunity. So, what is your objective in a case? It really is to come down to a well-justified course of action. And again, that's what I would stress, is that it has to be a course of action to improve the situation or performance of the organization you see in the case. So what you want to do in the end is make sure that you're recommending that the organization do something. And obviously, hopefully that will be backed up with a lot of analytical thinking and reasoning and rationale behind it. But you want to make sure that you actually are given a well-justified course of action. A specific recommendation must be made, and we'll emphasize that as we go through this workshop, that you want to tell the organization or recommend to the organization in the case confidently that this is what needs to happen if they're going to actually improve the situation. And hopefully, again, being supported by all the work that you've done that led up to your own recommendation. So in terms of maybe giving you a strategy or at least a process that you might want to utilize or at least modify for your own comfort level, when you're actually preparing for the case, the first thing I would say is obviously read the case, right? You want to make sure you do that, and probably more than once. But what's interesting in terms of reading the case is that people read the case differently, what I've seen over the years, and I don't think one way is better than the other. It's what you're comfortable with. And you will see even diversity within a case team. So some people like to first skim over the case very quickly, just to get a sense of what the case is about, broad overviews, and then they'll go back and then detail out kind of everything that they want to kind of zero in on. So then they take time kind of highlighting things or writing notes. Others will actually start right away doing that in terms of taking their time going through. So if you're in a situation where maybe some of you are a little bit faster in the team than others in terms of reading through the case and going through it the way you want, while others then on your team are actually still reading the case and making notes, you might then want to take some time to do something, like maybe start doing stuff on a board or doing some generic type of PowerPoint titles and things like that, just so that your time isn't necessarily wasted. But the idea is that you have to obviously take time to understand the case. Number two is examine the contents of exhibits. Cases are different. Some cases have a lot of information in exhibits and not necessarily in the text. And so if there is a lot of exhibits in your case, then what I would do is I would definitely go through those in a little bit more detail, because oftentimes you find through financial statements or financial information or just general information in appendixes and in exhibits where really the meat of the case is. And so you need to take time to actually look at those exhibits. So don't just kind of brush them off and just concentrate on what's actually been written. Look at the case as a whole. The thing that you need to do is obviously identify the strategic issues and factors, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about that in a second, about how you might going about that, but that'll be key, right? Because that's what you're going to eventually have to then deal with. You're going to analyze the situation described in the case, and probably point 5 would be important to kind of highlight, is that don't treat the facts in the case as gospel. And it's interesting in terms of case writers. Sometimes case writers strategically themselves will write a case and try and throw off those individuals who aren't reading the case in any type of in-depth manner. And what I mean by that is that they'll almost hint that an organization or an individual in an organization has to make a certain decision in a certain way, and yet if you actually read the case, it wouldn't actually go that way. It would be kind of a different decision or a different emphasis. And I remember, and I'll give you an example, I had a case team who did a competition, and their actual case dealt with kind of an international setting. And in the case, an individual who was kind of like the vice president of international for the company was trying to decide where the company should expand to. And the actual latter part of the case talked about this person deciding where they should expand to Europe. But truthfully, if you read the case well, it wasn't about expanding to Europe. It was actually expanding to another part of the world. And so people who didn't read the case very well automatically assumed that that's the issue that they needed to deal with, because that's what it sounded like in the case from the individual they were describing. And yet the idea was in the cases that they probably should have given the recommendation that, Joe, let's say was his name, Joe, we know you're thinking about expanding to Europe, but we actually think that's incorrect. What you really do is need to expand to like South America. And that's how kind of we've analyzed your situation. This is why we think it should actually go that way. So just because it says something in the case, don't necessarily think that it's gospel. Hopefully, again, you've done your own analysis to understand the situation and understand what is actually the appropriate action for the organization to take. You obviously want to use strong rationale, and probably more importantly, as you're going through the case, you want to make sure that you prepare a detailed action plan with some contingencies. And what that's trying to get at is it's one thing to come up with ideas. But you'll see in an example that we'll look at later, you also want to kind of get across to the judges how you would go about implementing your recommendations. Like actually specify out maybe over time or individuals that are involved in the organization to implement certain ideas. How would that actually happen? If you do that, it'll show then at least to the judging panel that not only have you come up with recommendations, but you're actually able to show them how these recommendations make sense. And how would they go on in kind of the organization in the case to actually implement them, right? That's the hard part, obviously, of actually getting things to change in an organization, is taking ideas and then somehow implementing them in terms of the organization. And sometimes as well, you may assume certain things or have certain contingencies that are tied to your plan of action. So maybe you give a recommendation, but in order for that recommendation to be feasible, you need more resources for the company. So that might be, might have to hire people, or you might actually have to borrow money to get, something in place. Well, if you recommend that, you should also think about the fact that how likely it is for us to get that extra money, how likely it is for us to be able to hire the right type of skill that we need if we don't have it right now. And then what do you do if that kind of falls through? So maybe you did say that you needed an extra $1 million to implement your recommendations, and you believed that you could get that based upon historical borrowing that the company or organization had done, or maybe there was assets that you saw that you could sell, things like that. Well, what happens if that falls through? So what's kind of your plan B? So if you have contingencies, it would also then show to an actual judging panel that you really have gone in depth, that you've really not just done a cursory recommendation, you've actually thought this out and also accounted for the fact that you could be wrong in certain things that you think might happen. And if you do that, then obviously it would show a greater strength, I think, in terms of your answer. You definitely need to take a role. It's important when you read a case because normally it's describing a situation. It's describing, an individual or the organization as in total dealing with an issue. The easiest way to approach a case is normally acting as if you were an outside consultant team giving advice. So you had been hired by that organization, presented with this information, and now you're giving recommendations as to what the organization or individual to do. Sometimes the case zeroes in on a specific individual who has to deal with a specific situation and make a specific type of recommendation. You could take on the role of the individual. And so let's say, again, going back to that international example, it was Joe who was the VP of International. You could come across as if you were Joe and you had done your analysis, and this is now what you were recommending to the board of that. But it's a lot easier if you actually take that outside consultant role, because again, that just makes it easier. And then again, you can then present yourself as a team of consultants and work from that way. You want to make sure that when you're presenting your ideas in this case competition, you're actually talking, quote unquote, to the client. So you're using words like, your situation. If we were to recommend to you, we're hoping that our recommendations will help your organizations accomplish this. So as if you have a conversation with the actual organization or the individual. So again, let's say the case is about an individual dealing with a certain issue. You would say, Joe, this is what we would do if we were in your position, right? Joe, we recommend this, or, your unit needs to do this. So again, doing that makes it, again, more realistic. you never ever talk about kind of in the case. So sometimes what happens is that teams will present their answer and they'll say, in the case it said this, or in the case this was the situation. It takes away then from that sense that you've immersed yourself in the situation. The whole idea is to almost do a role play where you're actually part of the situation described in the case. So it's not kind of like, divorced from you. It's actually, getting away from the artificiality of the situation where someone has handed you a paper-based case and you're kind of reading it. So you want to make as if, you're part of the situation that's happening right now. And sometimes that's very hard because obviously the case is given to you. It's a written type of document. It's describing the situation. It's easy to fall back in that, but you don't necessarily want to do that. It's not a good plan. Staying within the context of the case tries to get at the fact that sometimes the cases are historical in the sense that it deals with a situation that might have been 2 or 3 years ago and not kind of in the present time. If you're dealing with a case, let's say, that is happening right now or within the last kind of year, then it's easy to kind of stay within that context. But let's say you're dealing with a case that goes back 3 or 4 years, and maybe in that case it was important to understand kind of what was happening in the world at that time, or maybe exchange rates or inflation rates at that time. You can't use kind of what has happened after that case, or let's say with exchange rates, what are the exchange rates today? You'd have to look at what were the exchange rates back then when the actual case was happening. Or again, years and years ago, there was a case dealing with the airline industry that took place in the 90s. Well, the idea there is, even though that the students were given that case kind of in the mid-2000s, 9/11 didn't happen in the case. So you couldn't then know that someone was going to fly planes into the World Trade Centers and that would change the airline industry. You'd have to actually do the case as if you didn't have that knowledge. Those are extremely hard situations to deal with. But again, the idea is make sure that if there isn't a time period in the case and there are certain dates or years, that you're actually dealing with it in that context. Assumptions sometimes are necessary if you don't have enough information and you feel that the assumption is critical to what you're trying to accomplish. So sometimes your assumption may not be correct, but at least if you show to the judging panel that you made certain assumptions, even if they disagreed with the assumptions you made, they would then understand the context of your recommendation. And so if you're going to make any assumptions that are critical, just make sure you actually state those. And that would be important to do. And then what now I would do is I would refer you, if you could, to your case competition guide, one of the electronic handouts that I sent out, and we'll kind of just walk through that. One of your electronic handouts is actually called the case competition guide. It was actually from an accounting association who allowed me to send these out to students. And so you can read through this at your leisure, but what I would highlight for you is kind of on the bottom of page 3 of the electronic handout. And under user needs, it says again here, users are not always right about what their needs are. One way of focusing on user needs is to ask yourself, if I were the user, what would I want to see in my answer? Note the use of I in both cases. The question you should be asking yourself is, what would I be prepared to pay for if I were paying the consultant's bill or the employee's salary? Good role playing, again, what you're trying to do in the case, makes it almost impossible to do anything but cut right to the heart of the concerns presented in the situation. And that tries to, again, emphasize that just because something is said in the case, it may or may not be correct. Ideally, you would hope that it is, but sometimes, again, the emphasis might not be where it actually should be. And so just, again, don't take the things as gospel, as we said before. And then what I would do is highlight as well at the bottom of page 4, where it talks about presenting the case, and kind of that second paragraph. It says, criticizing past events you should have is not usually helpful. The user needs to know how to solve or improve the client situation, not be reminded of what has been done poorly in the past and cannot be corrected. So when you are making recommendations, so as you're presenting your ideas to the judging panel, you should try to avoid the use of if, the conditional tense, and qualifying words. If your recommendation starts with you could, perhaps, you should consider, or you might, you are not likely to be making a recommendation. The easiest way to ensure that you are clearly making a recommendation is to begin with, we or I recommend that. It is then very difficult for anyone to misinterpret your intention. And so when you're presenting ideas, be confident. right? Talk to the judging panel as if they're that organization, and that, you know, you are confident that this is what the organization should do, and this is, you're recommending this. You're not kind of qualifying your recommendation. You actually are coming out and saying, you know, through our analysis, this is what we believe you should be doing, and we are confident in that. And again, make sure that it's that strong recommendation that has then that course of action, and that will be good to actually do. A way in which you can possibly approach a case is through another handout. So the structured decision-making process is another electronic handout that you have, and it kind of walks you through kind of a process that you may or may not want to have, but it's a good one in the sense that many times people will fall back on a process like this, or something that actually is a modification of it. So again, talks about analyzing the situation, you know, establishing the objectives, or maybe identifying the issues. Then you would say, okay, with the issues now that we have thought this organization is dealing with, what are possible ways in which they can actually solve this? So you want to generate, you know, kind of a little list of alternatives. And this is where you're not judging which alternative yet is the best one, but you're saying, you know, in your situation, there are different ways in which you might handle it. So here are like 3 or 4, you know, feasible type of alternatives. Then you'd say to yourself, okay, how are we going to decide of the alternatives that we think are feasible, actually which are the best one or the best ones? Maybe it's a hybrid of a couple. You have to obviously somehow judge those alternatives, and that's normally based upon some type of criteria set that you want. So again, once you come up with your criteria, then again you can evaluate those alternatives. And what's interesting about criteria is that sometimes students will come up with a certain list of criteria, and then what will happen is that, you know, they won't necessarily, you know, think that there are different weighting. And you'll see an example that we'll go through how you should really understand whether or not certain criterion that you have set out are more important than others, because you might have to weight them differently when you actually are evaluating your alternatives. But probably what would be important is, again, when it talks about making a decision. So I think I would definitely star or circle this, or again highlight it in terms of the handout. It says, choose the alternative that best fits the criteria. In addition, and this is what's important, does the alternative pass the gut test? That is it intuitively sound, or does the consultant, or in this case the case team people, feel that there may be something wrong with this alternative? If an alternative is highly preferred analytically, so you've gone through your analysis and this is kind of what has come out, but does not pass the gut test, so you just don't feel comfortable with it, then a discussion to discover the cause of the discomfort with respect to the decision outcome is appropriate. Do not go forward on important high-stakes decisions unless the choice is positive on both an analytical and intuitive basis. And what it's trying to get at is, you can tell very quickly, right? Because like I mentioned before, I've been a judge at lots of case competitions, when the students who are presenting their recommendations really are doubtful in their own minds as to whether or not they're confident in these recommendations, right? So even though you can always fall back on a systematic process of these are the alternatives, we came up with criteria, we evaluated these alternatives, and this is kind of the best one. If you really think to yourself, you know, I never would have guessed that. I never would have thought that that was the alternative in the end that we would recommend. You might just want to go back through your analysis just to make sure you didn't make any type of error, because it's quite easy, especially in an example I'll show you in a second, as it relates to, you know, you can maybe do something where you're doing calculations and you just happen to do the calculation incorrectly. Everyone makes mistakes, but you know, if it doesn't pass that gut test, then you're not going to come across as being confident. So you should be up in front of the judges, presenting your ideas once you've done all your analysis, that, you know, not only intuitively is this correct, but it also ties into your analytical or systematic thinking, right? You want to have that integration of the two. You're going to then come across as being confident. You yourselves, even if you in the end up being incorrect, at least you'll come across that, yeah, you know, this is what we truly believe in. So you want to make sure about that. Don't have that hesitancy where, you know, yeah, we'll talk about this and we have the numbers to back it up, but I don't think this is right, right? That'll come across, and you don't want to do that. So hopefully that won't be the case with you. Sometimes in cases when you're trying to first start off and say, okay, before we get to alternatives, that we have to figure out what the problem or issue is. Sometimes they may have more than one problem or issue. And so again, the idea is just to be thorough, making sure that you just don't jump to conclusion right away. So read the case, analyze it, and making sure that you actually can get at it. And we'll talk about how you might want to look at solving or getting at a problem. You want to maybe articulate the problem or issue. There's a lot to be said that once you've come down to what you believe the issue or problem is, actually take a moment to write it down. It'll serve then as kind of the foundation for all your analysis. And just through the process of actually writing down what that problem or issue is and trying to encapsulate it either in a paragraph or a couple sentences, that in of itself oftentimes proves to be extremely valuable. Because if you can't articulate the problem or issues in words, it's really hard then to have a sound case analysis. And then again, some problems or issues aren't readily apparent. So you read through a case, you kind of think about it, and you think, so what is the issue here? It kind of just left in the middle of nowhere, and it really didn't seem much an issue. It's only maybe through going through an analysis then of the situation and looking at everything, do you really then see what that problem or issue is. A good way to actually think about how are we going to get at a problem or an issue is to understand what are kind of the foundational principles of diagnosing problems or issues, right? And again, we talk oftentimes in cases about problems, right? The issue, though, may not be a negative situation where you're trying to solve a problem. It might be an opportunity that you're trying to figure out the best way to take advantage of that opportunity. So it could be in a positive situation in that the organization is actually, working quite well, but now they have a great opportunity maybe to capitalize on. And it's about analyzing how best to capitalize on that opportunity. But again, in many cases, it is dealing with a certain problem or issue. And so these principles here, problem diagnosis, would be good to actually have an understanding of it. The first one is, again, suspending judgment or being objective. This kind of gets at this idea that we talked about a few times about not just assuming that something is in the case is correct, right? So take an objective viewpoint to things. Don't just automatically assume that what's written down is actually kind of the way you should go. The second one is problem versus symptoms. And I would say probably this is the biggest issue I see with many case teams and case competitions is that they don't truly get at the problem. They actually talk far more about a symptom of the actual problem. So as it says there in your handout, it says problems are root causes of situations. Symptoms are the consequences of the problem. So employee turnover and declining market share are symptoms, right? What is their cause? Ask the question why. So a problem wouldn't be that your organization is dealing with people leaving your organization. The question becomes is why are they leaving your organization? Or if you said, the problem in your situation is that your profits are going down. The question becomes for you is that's not the problem. That's a symptom. Why are the profits going down? That's what you're trying to get at. So if you can get at that, answering that question why, then you should feel confident that you've handled actually the situation well. Many times, unfortunately, I think students are really dealing more with the symptoms and not getting at the underlying problem. And the problem with that is that if you just deal with a symptom, you might solve something in the short term, but it'd be very unlikely that your recommendations would actually mitigate the situation in the long term, and that's what you're trying to get at. The idea of multi-causality tries to just get at whether you were thorough. So sometimes what happens is we jump to the conclusion too quickly about what actually is causing the problem or issue, and we think it's only one factor. There may be a multitude of factors, and sometimes that is something that you can only really get at if you're thorough in terms of your analysis. And sometimes cases are set up that way. It's trying to get students to see whether or not they will take that extra step or whether they'll jump to a conclusion right away. And so once again, if you're only solving maybe one factor that's impacting the problem, you'll probably just mitigate the level of issue or the level of the problem. You wouldn't actually solve the problem or issue wholeheartedly, right? Because again, you're only dealing with a certain aspect of it. The last one, interrelationship, is a really, really tough one if you found that in your case. But what's interesting is that oftentimes an example that's used on this kind of deals with agribusiness. So it talks about consider the chain of events that may explain the problem. Perhaps the problem surfaces only when A causes B, which in turn creates the problem. And so what we're going to try and get at here is this idea that let's say A is causing B, which then causes the problem. What we might find if we weren't thorough enough, we would say, okay, if factor B is present, that's when we have a problem. But because of the fact it's only when A causes B that causes the problem, if a factor C causes B, then we actually wouldn't have the problem. And so you're thinking to yourself, well, how would that kind of happen? Many times it deals with kind of the business cycle, or possibly even maybe the annual cycle. And let's say in an agribusiness, maybe again we're looking at a fall and spring type of weather, or a fall and spring type of time period. Maybe it's only the fall, if actually the factor B comes about, that we have the problem. Whereas in the spring, even if that factor B comes about, we don't actually have that problem. And so it's very hard to get at, but it just is again testing whether or not you're thorough in terms of your analysis, because the idea is that you could fall into the problem of just thinking that we've identified factor B, and so if we deal with that, it's fine, not realizing that, no, it isn't really factor B, it's about when factor B comes about that really kind of gets at that. And so that's what the idea of an interrelationship. So if you have kind of that understanding of the underlying principles of problem diagnosis, that probably will lend you a good foundation to actually getting at whatever the problem is. Lots of ways in which to kind of, analyze cases and, start your strategic analysis. 5 forces model that many of you probably know from Porter's, kind of looking at the situation and looking at the various forces or stakeholders that impact. And 5 forces is really just getting at almost like a simplified stakeholder analysis, where you're looking at things like, how easy it is to get into the industry. What's the rivalry there? Obviously if it's a lot of rivalry, that's not necessarily the best situation to be in. If it's easy for competitors to get into your business, then that's not a great situation, right? If it's very hard, it takes maybe a lot of capital investment, that would be a good situation. Again, it's kind of analyzing that. Again, power of buyers and suppliers, I'm sure many of you know that. SWOT is very characteristic in terms of an analysis, where what you're doing there is you're looking at kind of an internal analysis of the organization as well as an external analysis, right? So strengths and weaknesses, which is what SW stands for there, are more in terms of the internal situation. So what are the strengths? What are the weaknesses of the organization? And then in the external environment, you're looking at opportunities and threats, which is the O and T in the SWOT analysis. So you're looking at, okay, what are the opportunities out there for this organization and what are the threats? And the idea then is looking at those integrating together. And again, if you're in a situation where you have lots of great strengths in the organization and not many weaknesses, and again, lots of great opportunities in the external environment, but not necessarily many threats, that might be an opportunity then to capitalize on those opportunities. Whereas if things are reversed, where you have lots of weaknesses, not a lot of strengths, very few opportunities, and yet major threats in your external environment, that could be a problem. And you need to somehow then make sure that you survive to kind of fight another day as an organization, because the situation isn't very good there. And again, a TOWS or TOWS analysis is where you're just kind of reversing that and putting the emphasis on the external environment coupled with the internal environment. You should always test your own assumptions about the case. So again, as I mentioned before, you don't want to just assume something. So, if you're going down a certain way, see if the analysis backs that up. The worst thing you can do is make certain recommendations or certain conclusions without really any evidence. In management and in business, we're big about evidence-based management. And so going through, the case, analyzing the information you're given. If you have to make certain assumptions, then make them, make sure they're realistic, but don't just jump to conclusions. Make sure that it's actually backed up by what you actually find in the case. In terms of coming up with alternatives, so let's say again, you've gone through it, you've done your strategic analysis, you now think you know what the issue or issues are. How do you come up with alternatives? Well, the idea is what is feasible, right? And sometimes do nothing can be an alternative. Maybe it's a situation where right now the best thing for the organization to do is just hold steady. So don't be scared if you truly believe that the organization can actually run into more problems if they try and really do something totally different. Sometimes, just doing things as you are for the time period might just then gives you that foundation or enhance your foundation, so when things do change or need to change, you're then prepared for it. So again, do nothing can be an alternative to that. Criteria would be another important thing if you need to evaluate the alternatives. And I mentioned to you before about how we'll show you an example. So one of the things that you should look at is an example where this was from a winning competition that students did that actually dealt with an actual a written case answer rather than an oral one that you'll be doing. And we'll kind of look at maybe some ways in which they approach coming up with a criteria set to evaluate their various alternatives. In terms of the electronic handout there that kind of dealt with this recommendation and implementation for Express Monte, just to give you a context of what the students did here, it dealt with a case, and very much actually like that example I talked about before in terms of international expansion, it actually dealt with a coffee company. And they were looking at where they should expand kind of their operations around the world. And so if you look at that electronic handout, you'll see at the top there that they have kind of a criteria set. And so what they did on the far left-hand side is they actually put down, okay, what would be important criteria if we're thinking about moving into different areas with coffee? Well, one of the things we might want to look at in terms of countries that we could possibly expand to, what actually is the coffee consumption in those countries? It would make sense that if a country had a population that didn't drink much coffee, it might not be the best thing to expand on that. Talk about income, just going down there, some coffee sales that are already there, how urban is the marketplace, what is the concentration, how easy it is to doing business. And so if you look there on the left-hand side, they actually have rank then the criteria. And so this gets back to this idea that maybe not all the criteria are equal. And so what they did is they actually ranked all the criteria all the way from 9 to 1. I myself, what I like to do with the criteria is have it actually total, let's say, out of 100% or maybe 1.0. So let's say you had 4 different criteria, A, B, C, and D. And I know, let's say A dealt with, financial viability or, ease of implementation. What may happen with these 4 is rather than seeing them equal where they'd be kind of worth each 0.25 or 25%, maybe the idea is that the first factor is, or criterion is very important. And maybe that's worth like then 0.6. And maybe factor B is worth 0.2, and then C and D are worth 0.1 each. So in total, it adds up to 1.0 or 100% if you did it in percentages. It is extremely rare that if you come up with a criteria set, that all the criterion in that set are going to be equal. And if you don't explain that to your judging panel, that'll probably be a question that come up in the sense that they'll say, it seems like you ranked all those criteria the same. What is your rationale for that? And if it was the same, just again maybe explain why you think that there isn't any differentiation. Whereas you see in terms of what the students did, there actually was a rank order on that. And then what they did is they took each country and then they took a ranking or an amount from 1 to 10 as it related to each one of those criterion. So they would then take each country, so let's say for example Italy, and they say in terms of coffee consumption, we'd rank that about a 7. And so all they do then is take the weight that they assigned to that factor, which was 9, multiply it by 7 and get a total of 63. And you can see that for all of the countries they did. And then based upon adding up then the totals, it gave you an idea of where actually they should expand. And so it's a simple way in which to kind of do, a ranking of your alternatives. You take, again, all your alternatives that are possibly feasible. You look at the factors that would be important to, have as your criteria. And then, based upon those factors, kind of ranking each one of then your alternatives to come up with a total. So again, straight calculation. Again, you may or may not want to do that. It's one that's often used. It's very kind of quantitative. And, even though maybe Quantitatively, you might find that a couple alternatives are close. That's where then you could go to obviously more qualitative information or analysis that you've done and kind of combine the two. Ideally, quantitative and qualitative methodologies integrated probably will give you the best way in which to determine your alternatives. So again, things that you might want to think about in terms of when you evaluate your alternatives. Can the company afford it? Again, it makes no sense to recommend something, even if it comes out analytically, if the feasibility of implementing it is virtually not there. And if the company can't afford it, maybe you could then provide an additional suggestion as to, okay, this is how we think the resources or money that could come into the company to actually get them to implement the recommendations that we think are the best in terms of what the organization needs. Is this solution likely to evoke a competitive response? Most organizations, or virtually all, don't work in a bubble. So if you recommend something to an organization and that organization is in a very competitive environment, the competitors are not just going to allow another organization to take over the market or to improve. They will react to that. And so what you may want to do in your recommendation is talk about the fact that you understand this. That here you're recommending this to this organization, you realize that the competitors or the people they're competing against are going to also do something, and you recognize that, and then you might take the analysis or recommendation one step further and say, when this occurs, this is also then what we recommend. And again, it allows you then to show your depth of analysis and understanding of the actual environment of the organization. Will the employees accept the change, right? So just because you think it's good, if it's a company that has lots of employees that might be resistant to change, maybe you have to couple then your implementation strategy with an educational process of the employees so that the employees are then more likely to accept the change. Because if the organizational culture is such that a recommendation that you give isn't a good fit, then probably it's going to be doomed right from the start. And people will pick up on that if, again, a judging panel doesn't hear you talk about the fact that you understand the situation and you've now, gave a recommendation on top of your main recommendation as to how to kind of mitigate any type of organizational resistance. How will it affect other stakeholders? Again, given the fact that you're going to recommend something, what is the impact on the stakeholders? And again, does it fit with the vision, mission, objectives, culture, values of the company? So let's say the organization is in a situation where financially they need more revenue coming in. There may be lots of different alternatives in which you can actually get more revenue into the organization. However, the key will be is whether or not certain ones of those alternatives really don't fit with the organization's kind of culture or vision. So just because you can actually do something that will give you, let's say, more money, doesn't necessarily mean you would want to do that if it's not a fit with who you are. You always have to understand that organizations kind of have a core to them. And if you're going to recommend something that goes against that core, again, the values or where they actually see kind of their place in the marketplace or where they want to go, then the question will come back to you is that, that can make us more money or that, but it's something we would never do. So why would you recommend that? So one of the things that you have to really look at and understand is that what actually is at the heart of this organization, and does our recommendations really make sense as it relates to kind of what that organization is trying to do? So again, when you're making recommendations, hopefully that is supported by your analysis. Again, that evidence-based management. So you've spent a lot of time, either doing SWOT analysis, further analysis, financial analysis. You want to make sure that that's backing up your recommendations. You want to describe exactly what needs to be done and why the course of action will solve the issue or problem. And then again, having a detailed implementation plan. So I'll refer you back again to the handout that dealt with that student situation with the coffee company. And you'll see at the bottom, they actually do a 5-year implementation timeline. Now, your case might have a different timeline. You might want to implement your ideas over like 6 months or 1 year. The whole idea, though, is that when you actually are giving your recommendations, if even you can graphically show how you're going to go about implementing it and giving some details, it'll be impressive because it takes the case one step further in terms of your answer, that you're saying, we do understand that a question could come up about, okay, how do you recommend or implement the recommendations that you put in, right? Here's an opportunity for you to actually show that you've actually thought about how this will work over time, or maybe the individuals that are actually associated with putting these into place. You might even have a phase-in process, right? So, I mean, phase one, if it doesn't lend itself to kind of a timeline, you might be a phase approach. So phase one, you do this, and then phase two, doing this. If there are contingencies as it relates to those phases, you might talk about that. So as it says here, a budget or contingency plan can also help you. So let's say that there are costs associated along the way with your implementation. We'll actually show that and show how you've budgeted for that and where those resources will come from. If, again, certain things are contingent on other things happening, again, show that. So maybe in phase one, before you get to phase two, certain things might have to happen. Again, you would show them that if they didn't happen, this is then what you would do rather than necessarily jumping right again to phase two. So again, the more in-depth type of background and knowledge and implementation plan you can bring to the table, the more likely it is that that's going to give confidence to the judges of saying, yeah, this team really understands what they're doing. Let's say now you've done your analysis, you have a sense of the way you're going to go with your recommendations and implementations, you thought about contingency plans. Now you have to present the case. With this case competition, it is all about presenting your ideas orally. Some case competitions are different. Some are solely just written, where you do a written case answer. Some might be stages, where you'll do a written answer to then qualify to get to the next stage, or it would be a combination of the two. With this case competition, in terms of the Cor Van Raay agribusiness competition, you're going to be actually asked to do an oral presentation. And so here are maybe some hints in terms of how you might want to go about presenting your case answer. A good way to start off to make everyone comfortable is actually introducing your team. Again, it'll give you a sense then that everyone's kind of been working together. As I mentioned, if you take that role of the outside consultant, maybe again you've come up with a name for your consulting team, and you talk about the fact, hi, I'm Dan and this is my colleague, Jane, and things like that. If you introduce the team, it gets everyone at least started off on the fact that this is who we are a team, and now we're going to present our ideas. Sometimes what happens, let's say if you have your first PowerPoint slide, sometimes I've seen, rather than having agenda at the top and then a listing of what you might want to do, people will put like table of contents. Table of contents really is only a title you should ever see in a written document. And yet I've seen sometimes students do that in an actual oral presentation. You always want to have an agenda because, again, it really is a conversation. It's a meeting, right? You're actually now presenting your ideas. And so you kind of talk about the idea of having, this type of process over the course of the next minutes that you're going to be giving your answer. And so under that, then you might start off with, again, the first thing you do is identifying the problem. Sometimes what some students do after they kind of outline how the presentation will go is they'll start with like an executive summary. So they'll actually have a slide where they will show to the judging panel how in the end they'll actually come up with the answer. So they give people kind of a snapshot of actually what that final answer will be, and then they'll talk about the fact what we'll do now in the next minutes with you is that we'll explain how we actually got to that. So there's different ways to handle it. It's what you'd be comfortable with. But again, traditionally, you probably would start off with kind of that problem statement or issue statement and then follow from there. You'll then probably talk about alternatives. Again, talk about that criteria. And as we mentioned before, maybe giving some rationale as to how you weighted that criteria, evaluating the alternatives, coming up with a recommendation. And again, that implementation, going back to that electronic handout, you might actually show the idea there as to how it's going to take place over time if there are some contingencies, and then wrapping it up. One of the things in the end that you want to get across is that you are confident, again, in your recommendations. So you want to reiterate that your recommendations, as outlined in the implementation plan, will solve this issue. And you want to make sure you leave the actual presentation at the end with the fact that you've kind of solved the issue. You've kind of outlined how you went about doing it, and you're confident that if the organization took your ideas and implemented it as you have laid out, then they'll actually solve that issue. So again, it's important to understand that. When you're actually doing your PowerPoint, right, sometimes, unfortunately, people utilize the PowerPoint as almost a script. So you'll see, a lot of information on each slide, and they'll kind of almost just read off the slide. The idea is just to really have them as points. So the idea with PowerPoint slides is not about detailed sentences, but the idea is that, look, you have a certain substance that you want to get across. And what your PowerPoints are doing is they're allowing you to really just clue into what you want to talk about. So in good presentations, if you see people do presentations over time, even if they're talking about the exact same thing, the exact words that they use today will not be the exact words they'll use tomorrow to explain the same topic. The substance will be the same, but the words will be slightly changed. Sometimes what happens when you utilize slides, or if you have notes and you're trying to memorize the exact words, or in your mind you have paragraphs that you want to talk about, if for whatever reason you get thrown off by a word or you forget a word or something, it throws all of the presentation off. The idea is that you should be comfortable. These gives you ideas of what you want to talk about, and now you just have a conversation. So talk, as if you are having that conversation with the organization. Again, agenda highlighted on. This is kind of a technique that sometimes certain people will use, and again, it depends on your comfort level. And as I said, there's no right way to do it. This is just a suggestion. Sometimes what will happen, let's say you did have on your agenda kind of first of all a problem, and then alternatives, criteria, things like that. You would actually on the bottom of each slide or on the side of each slide actually have those topics in your agenda put out there. So again, let's say here we had problem identification, and then maybe there's an analysis, alternatives, criteria, evaluation, and recommendation. You have the same thing here. Well then, wherever you are in your presentation in terms of slides, so let's say we had a slide where we were talking about alternatives. What would happen then is actually where you had alternatives on the agenda, either on the side or at the bottom, that would actually be then highlighted, and that way the judging panel would know kind of where you are and how it's tied to what you initially set out in your agenda. Now you can do that or not. That's totally up to you. But again, it gives more structure and more context to your actual explanation. As well, sometimes what I've seen in competitions, actually I've seen it a lot, is that figures are used as kind of analogies or a way to structure the presentation on there. So what you may say is that, look, as an organization, so if I was presenting a case answer, I would say, this is where you are today. Through actually looking at the information you provided us, we realize that you want to be over here. We are going to show you as a team, as we go through our presentation, how you're going to get from where you are today into where you want to be. And then what will happen each time you actually do a slide is you start to draw some type of a figure at the bottom. So maybe it's like a bridge. So, eventually then as you're going through, you're actually adding to the bridge, and eventually you have the whole bridge made. And so what you then say on your last slide is, here we've shown you, as time gone on, you've seen how we've built that bridge from where you are today where you want to be tomorrow. Sometimes there's a house analogy. I've seen this a lot too, where you kind of start off and you build the foundation of the house and things like that. And then at the end, you can always say, like, we're home. It might sound corny to you, but if you do it in a structured way, it actually does have some impact. Another fascinating way that I've seen it done is actually was done from a team from the University of Lethbridge quite a few years ago, and they actually won their case competition. They started off with a wall. And so what they did is they actually had a wall, and they drew a solid wall on the first slide. And then as they went through their presentation, they started to take, and I still don't know how they did it, pieces of the wall out. And behind the actual wall, there was actually text. And in the end, when the wall was completely taken down on the last slide, what was left was actually all the text that spelled out their solution or recommendation. And it was really fascinating. It really impressed the judges. Now again, it may or may not work for you. You may have the competency or not to have that. The idea is that anytime you can maybe give some type of analogy or show an analogy, it could possibly help your situation. Knowing the judging criteria always help. Unfortunately, again, one of the electronic handouts you got was actually the criteria you're going to see as it relates to how the judges will score you. You yourself now, because you know what the judges are going to concentrate on, and again, you can see it about organization, the mechanics, the time management, the delivery. You'll see that those are not weighted, extremely high. However, the content knowledge is quite high, right? 60%. And so you know then where you want to put your emphasis. Plus, it also talks about, what would differentiate people scoring on certain levels, right? In terms of getting to certain levels. So again, you can almost then prejudge your own presentation. One of the things I would recommend in terms of time management is that as you're going through thinking about how you're going to approach the case and how you're going to do your work, you need to set aside some time towards the end of your preparation before you go and present your ideas to actually practice. Right? You almost need to have a cutoff point in your own mind as where you're going to say, that's good enough, or we need to get this done in the next 5 minutes because we need to practice. It is very evident when students come to present ideas and they really have not practiced their presentation. And by practicing your presentation, after you've done it a few times, you'll probably be able to see whether or not there are some weaknesses based upon the judging criteria. And if there are, you might have time then in which to kind of mitigate it or enhance that particular section that will allow you then to score higher, right? Because the idea is that, you want to do a good job, and there isn't necessarily a right answer, but you also hopefully want to try to do the best job you can. And if you understand how you're going to be benchmarked or judged, it gives you a huge advantage. And oftentimes in case competitions, you may not necessarily know precisely how you're going to be judged, but in this case you do. And I would definitely then, think about that as you're trying to, customize your own presentation. At the end here, what I've done in your slides is I've tried to give you maybe almost like aids that you may or may not want to use that deal with kind of different types of financial situations, and in the end, almost like a little template. And so you can use these or not, but the idea is that in many times in cases, you will be given some financial information, and financial information really has validity only if you can kind of look at trends. It's very hard to gather a lot of information if you don't have some type of benchmark. So if you don't have like an industry benchmark, or if you don't have financial information over time, you can do analysis on a given year, but it doesn't necessarily lend a lot of insight. So as it says on the slides here, you want to kind of identify financial trends over time, maybe again across companies at a given point in time. If financial analysis is kind of just in isolation, doesn't really help a huge amount. And again, through kind of seeing trends, you may find whether or not certain situations are getting better or worse. Sometimes even on the surface, if it doesn't look positive, if you actually maybe have industry data, you may find that actually the individual company or organization is actually doing quite well, even though just on the surface it looks like they're declining, but everyone in the industry as a whole, their competitors, are declining at a far greater rate than they are. So it puts oftentimes the financial analysis into context if you have this additional information. If you don't have it, there's not a lot you can do about that. So what I've done for you is I've given you various types of ratios under different categories that talk about how you would actually utilize financial statements or financial information that's given to you in terms of coming up with the way they're expressed, the formula for calculating them, and probably more importantly is actually the meaning of what these are, and that gives you that context there. So we have stuff on liquidity ratios, profitability, activity type of ratios, leverage in terms of how, they utilize some of their debt, and then some other ratios that deal more with kind of public companies, and they may or may not be applicable. It's just an added resource. There is no requirement to use them. You may find in your case that a lot of the information isn't valuable to do financial analysis. You may find the reverse though, right? So again, it just gives you an opportunity maybe to have an aid if again you haven't had a lot of experience with financial ratio analysis. And then what I also talk about is the idea that with financial statements, if you're given them, it's interesting in the sense you want to make sure hopefully that you can do some comparisons over time, look at categories that change from year to year. You can also break down the financial statements in terms of percentages. So again, if you're given an income statement, maybe it's not as insightful to know like the percentage of expenses increasing. Maybe it's important to know though what is that percentage of the overall revenue in terms of the expenses, or the cost of goods sold, and has that changed over time? So you can actually break it down that way. Sometimes you're even given financial information where you're not giving the absolute numbers, but you're actually just giving the actual percentages, and that in and of itself is something you have to be prepared to actually deal with. And again, adjusting for inflation. It hasn't been a big issue in the last few years, but certain parts of the world, inflation is a big deal. So just because revenue goes up, and might go up substantially, it may not necessarily have anything to do with the performance of the company. It could just be that prices, because of inflation, are just rising so quickly. And so, what a good might have sold for $1, half a year ago, now sells for $2. So yeah, we see a 100% increase in the actual revenue per unit, but that had nothing to do with any changes. It was just based upon inflation. So if you're in an inflationary situation, also, factor that in as well. Again, the common size statements, that's again where it's been converted to percentages, and that can sometimes give you some insight. There are some economic things that you might want to just look at. The prime interest rate is again what interest rates charge for their best clients. You might have something where there's more economic data that relates to the GDP and that impact. And then finally, what I've done is I've given you an example of what we call a strategic audit worksheet. And this is something, again, you can use or not. What it does, it kind of just highlights certain things that you might want to look at in terms of your analysis, just to make sure that you haven't kind of missed anything. So it starts off with this idea, what is the current situation? Looking at past performances. Is that plus or minuses? Again, getting at SWOT. So again, you look at kind of the governance of the actual organization. So maybe there are issues kind of with governance. Maybe the board of directors isn't structured properly. Maybe the control functions are a little bit off. Then you can start to look at a SWOT analysis. So where it says external environment, that deals with EFAS is the external factor analysis summary. And so you're looking at then what's actually happening in the environment to get at your opportunities and threats. The one below deals with strengths and weaknesses. So that's the internal factor analysis summary, and that deals with IFAS, and that talks more about things that are happening within the organization, all the various types of functional areas. So looking at what's happening with the marketing, the finance. You may find it applicable or not. The idea is that it kind of just gives you almost like a checklist of what to look at, and then looking at whether or not it's a plus or minus in that situation. And then overall then kind of integrating them together in terms of strategic factors. So again, SFAS stands for strategic factor analysis summary, and then getting to the point all the way in the end where you actually are talking about implementation, and then also maybe evaluating and controlling for that. And that's something that I really did not speak about before, but maybe one of the important things as well in your actual overall plan is making sure that somehow you talk about how the progress on maybe your phases or your implementation will actually be evaluated, and how you will maybe mitigate anything that doesn't quite work out in terms of the way you've said that this should roll out, right? Because we have kind of an ideal situation where what we're going to recommend and what we say the way we're going to implement it will work out, but maybe the idea is that along the way you need to assess how you're going to evaluate whether or not that's going out well or not. So once again, let's emphasize that there are a lot of ways in which to approach the case. These are just some examples or some hints or some types of resources that you may or may not want to utilize. You yourself as a team have to develop your own methods, right? And again, I can't stress enough that yes, doing the case is an important part of the competition, but there is so much more richness in this competition. You're going to get to meet other students. You're going to meet people from the industry. You're going to be able to hear, keynote speakers. It's the whole experience as a whole that is valuable. And I want to emphasize the word thank you again, because as students you have busy lives, lots of things are going on. It says a lot that you're going to volunteer, to spend a weekend, in the competition, and I think you're going to have a wonderful time. And so I myself will definitely stop in and look at some of the presentations. So I'll look forward to hearing you, and hopefully you found the workshop of some value. Thanks a lot.